Analysis, we can bring in John Lyndon, the executive director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. First, how would you evaluate Netanyahu's trip to the U.S. overall? What do you think he was hoping to get out of it, and did he achieve it?
Well, I think the primary utility of the trip from the Prime Minister's perspective was political, archly political. And the key audience for him, I think, were people back in Israel. It was scheduled in the afternoon in Washington, but the early evening in Israel to maximize TV audiences. And I think from that perspective, he'll probably be very satisfied, to see standing ovations over and over, even though many of them weren't from members of Congress. There was a lot of people in that room that weren't members of Congress. Many stayed away from it, many Democrats in particular. But that won't have mattered for audiences in Israel. We'll see a lot of their key talking points around this war being very articulately put forward by a prime minister who's very unpopular inside Israel at the moment. Over 60% of people want him to stand down. And I think he will see a bump in the polls from it. And I think that's its utility. And in the United States, we had the speech by President Biden later that same day explaining why he's not running for re-election. And that really overtook Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit for most American audiences.
As you mentioned, a lot of Congress people stayed away from Netanyahu's speech. We also saw these big protests on Capitol Hill. Is that something that was broadcast in Israel as well? And is that likely to impact opinion at all?
Yes. So the protests, particularly the most extreme aspect of them. So there was people using graffiti that was daubed on monuments, championing Hamas and the United States flag being burned. Those things were very prevalent in the Israeli media coverage the following day. And I think it allows many people in Israel to think that the people who oppose this war, which is a majority of people in the United States who want to see a ceasefire, are somehow represented by these most extreme fringes of the protest movement. And I think that's a real problem because Israelis feel very sincerely and genuinely scared because of the events of October 7th, and now a sense that there's a protest movement internationally that's opposed to them and their existence, when in fact I think very many people just want this war to end and want the hostages to be returned, which is why it was good to hear Vice President Harris really make that point in her comments, really to give a more sort of moderate or sensible framing for those people who want to articulate why a deal and an end to this war is so urgent.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what you made of Kamala Harris's comments. There's the sense that she could be slightly more critical of Israel than Joe Biden has been if she wins the White House. Do you think that that's the case? And how would her coming into power sort of impact the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
I think we've already seen a slight change in tone, and some of this is generational. I mean, President Biden probably represents a perspective on Israel and the Democratic Party, which is he's maybe the last example of this. Whereas Vice President Harris is a younger generation. She is, even in the way that the context and the tone of her comments, there was obviously friendship for Israel, which I expect to continue. There is a lot of bipartisan support for the state of Israel and grassroots support for Israel in the United States. But being a friend of Israel also comes with concern. And I think that she conveyed that and said something very important about not being afraid to speak up around the need for this war to end. And I expect that to be the continuing tone between now and the election. She's obviously still the serving vice president, so she's not going to overly criticize the policies of the serving president. But should she win in November, and should we have 4 years of President Harris, I would expect there to be some shifts and changes to what we've seen so far, where President Biden is probably the most pro-Israeli president in U.S. history.
And is it fair to say, as we heard in that report, Netanyahu suggesting that American criticism of Israel is preventing a ceasefire deal? What do you make of that stance?
No, I don't think there's any evidence that that's the reason there's no ceasefire. There's leaks coming today from Israel, from people who are pretty high up, it sounds like, inside the Israeli security services, that are actually placing the blame for the lack of a deal at Prime Minister Netanyahu's feet, about a hardening of demands around, in particular, two key corridors inside the Gaza Strip remaining in Israeli hands, and some sort of a mechanism to prevent Hamas fighters returning to the north. Now, these elements were not in the deal before, war. And the suggestion is that their insertion now creates further complications and delays. We know that there's a team going to Rome next week to try and conclude this deal. And I think a lot of people are concerned that, this has gone, it's ebbed and flowed. At times, Hamas have seemed to be most responsible for the deal being delayed or slowed. At other times, it's appeared to be Prime Minister Netanyahu. At no time whatsoever do I think it's been what the United States has said or not said.
Because while Netanyahu was away, his far-right allies blamed the U.S. for putting Israel's security at risk by pushing for a ceasefire. How much longer do you think that Netanyahu's coalition is going to be able to hold on?
So it looks as if it's going to last at least until the sort of winter session of the Knesset, when the Knesset returns around October, November, because it's about to go on an extended summer break, which a lot of people are pretty annoyed about inside Israel, considering the number of threats and challenges right now. So it means that the coalition cannot practically collapse until the Knesset reconvenes. Now, that does give Netanyahu space and time to be able to secure a ceasefire deal, should he accord enough priority to it. But also potentially to put in place some real plans for the day after, which, his speech in Congress, it was kind of forecast beforehand that he would say something substantive about the day after in Gaza. It was very light on detail. That's one of the biggest challenges with his far-right coalition partners. And I think a real sort of test for statesmanship now is, can he put together some ideas, plans, practical steps that can not just end this war, but restore some level of hope for people inside Gaza that this nightmare is going to end.
And just finally, do you believe that Netanyahu is hoping for Donald Trump to return to the White House?
I mean, most observers would conclude that that's probably the case. It's strange because I think both President Biden and President Trump have been incredibly pro-Israeli by Netanyahu or any Israeli standards. But, I would have a slight warning alongside that. I do think it's likely if President Trump wins that he will do a lot of things that are materially supportive for Israel, particularly more right-leaning analysis of what is good for Israel, perhaps, some of which actually I think is quite counterproductive for Israel's long-term interests. But President Trump is also mercurial, and we know that there is a complicated personal relationship. The first time Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump have spoken since the last presidential election was on the 4th of July, with their relationship having reportedly collapsed in the interim because Prime Minister Netanyahu had congratulated President Biden on his election win. So the one thing we know about Trump is that he's very unpredictable. He did issue some statements that were interesting over recent weeks. He responded very warmly to a letter from Palestinian President Abbas, wishing him well after the assassination attempt. And he did call for this war to end several times. People don't really understand exactly what he means, but it does appear to be some sort of a soft demand that the war should be brought to an end as soon as possible.
All right, John Lyndon, thank you, as always, so much for your analysis. Again, that's John Lyndon, Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace.